Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Ryan Robinson, and I work in the Protestant faculty here at the University of Bonn. I want to welcome you today. It's my distinct privilege to host today's lecture at the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies. Greetings to all of you online, and I want to welcome everyone to this Joseph C. Miller Memorial Lecture. As I said, my name is Matthew. I'm a theologian and scholar of religion working in the area of world Christianity and intercultural theology here at the university. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Dr. Joerg Rieger. Professor Rieger is Distinguished Professor of Theology, Cal Turner Chancellor's Chair of Wesleyan Studies, and the founding director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee in the United States. He is a prolific author and editor of around 27 books and over 200 academic articles. And I mention only two of his more recent monographs, which I think hold particular relevance to work that is done here in the center. From 2022, Theology in the Capitalocene, Ecology, Identity, Class, and Solidarity. And from 2016, co-authored, I believe, with your wife, if I'm not mistaken, Unified, We Are a Force, How Faith and Labor Can Overcome America's Inequalities. I'd also like to highlight one additional recent publication with a direct connection to the BCDSS. The March 2025 issue of the Journal of World Christianity was a product of a working group of the BCDSS, the World Christianity Studies and Asymmetrical Dependencies Working Group. It was organized by David Brandon Smith. Many of you, I believe, know him. And of course, everyone here knows Julia Winnebeck. And they co-authored an article in that special issue addressing new horizons in world Christianity studies and asymmetrical dependency. Professor Rieger contributed one of the main articles to that issue on distinguishing privilege and power in global Christianities. And this is a distinction which it's also in the book on Theology in the Capitalocene, but I've learned about really directly from you, kind of understanding that power or that privilege does not necessarily lead to or necessarily imply having a lot of or significant power. Professor Rieger also contributed a main article to that issue, as I said, and so he is no stranger to the BCDSS in that sense, but has already been a conversation partner with one of the working groups for a while. In the monographs and in that article, Professor Rieger works on the past with a keen eye toward present challenges, while also using the analysis of present challenges to inform the ways that he approaches historical inquiry. In this way, it seems to me there are interesting resonances to explore between his research and the work of the BCDSS. For his title today, he has offered Unite and Conquer in Order to Divide and Conquer. Religion, Race, Class, and the Possibility of Solidarity in the United States then and now. Joerg, we are very much looking forward to the lecture and to the discussion to follow, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for that introduction. It's good to be in Bonn. I was here last 1992, so that's a long time ago. And I think a lot has changed for the better. So I'm really looking forward to working with all of you. You may not be able to tell from my accent in English. If I spoke German, you would know I'm from the South. Joerg Rieger, the way we pronounce it, Joerg Rieger in English. Taught in the south of the United States for about 30 years. So it's good to be back and forth and to see new generations in Germany studying important things. So thank you for the invitation to this lecture. I will be reading a lot of it just to save time, because if I wouldn't read them, I'd go on forever. And so this way, I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and since this is a good-sized group, we can have a conversation. So think about questions, challenges. This is what makes it fun for me. If you push back or if you raise some difficult questions, then you've made this worth my own while. So thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. So here we go. My presentation will begin with a reflection on slavery in the United States, which is tied to specific entanglements of race and class. The lessons from these entanglements are still relevant for the present in the United States, but also elsewhere. But you can be the judge of that, and we'll talk about it. By the way, the book that you have on this slide, Theology in the Capitalocene, is the one that Matthew just mentioned. It is now being translated. Actually, it just has been finished, the translation into German, and will be coming up in Kohlhammer Verlag at some point in the next couple of months, so you can check it out in German or much of it. In the United States, enslavement of African Americans, this is, of course, one of the huge parts of US history. But what is not oftentimes realized is that it did tremendous damage, not just to African Americans, but really to everybody else. Because it kept down not only the enslaved themselves, but most working people. Here's a quote from Frederick Douglass, himself a former slave who escaped slavery, who noted, "The slave is robbed by his master of all his earnings above what is required for his physical necessities. And the white man is robbed by the slave system because he's flung into competition with a class of laborers who work without wages." The fact is that Southern white workers did not only earn less than Northern white workers, they also made less than Northern black workers. It has been argued that capitalism in the United States continues to be so harsh in its treatment of working people because it developed in this context of slavery. Slavery in the US produced a hierarchy of labor with clear demarcations of who was at the top and who was at the bottom. With those in the middle put into service of those at the top without gaining similar benefits, and often worse off than the middle class in the North. Moreover, the meticulous control over slave labor in the South prefigured the subsequent use of similar control of industrial labor in the North. In addition, the exploitation of slave labor for the production of cotton was mirrored in the extraction of the resources of the land for the same purpose. Contemporary forms of capitalism continue to combine the exploitation of work and extraction of natural resources along the lines of race and class. In what follows, I will argue that transformation of these deeply entrenched structures is impossible without broad-based solidarity. So here's a term that is, of course, at the heart of my Capitalocene book, but we'll talk about solidarity here as maybe the term that will help us in the present in various places around the world. Now, keep in mind that the solidarity I'm talking about is more than just a pious idea. In American history, it has taken shape time and again by all those who stood shoulder to shoulder in the fight for transformation. This includes women, African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants from around the world, and many others. The basis of this solidarity is not wishful thinking or moral exhortation, but common interest. As historian Joerg Rieger notes in regard to African American history, righteousness was not the basis for the movement that opened opportunities to Black Americans. Emancipation and even Reconstruction were produced by a convergence of interests among disparate constituencies: African Americans, abolitionists, business, small freeholders, and Northern laborers, united under the banner of free labor. When solidarity becomes a reality in this way, it does not go unnoticed by the powers that be. As a result, they try to subvert it in any way they can. Various mechanisms are employed to diffuse solidarity. This slide shows you a couple of them. Just for example, not hard for the dominant powers to be inclusive and hospitable, especially when they own the house where hospitality is to be offered, and when they oversee the system into which minorities are to be included. And of course, it's easy to be inclusive when you're the gatekeeper. In the United States, middle-class professionalism is another time-honored example that diffuses solidarity. as professional privilege appears to promise a safe place in the system, even for some minorities, typically in exchange for not challenging it and not rocking the boat. Another way to deal with the challenges of the solidarity is to co-opt it for the status quo. The political right, in close alignment with the Christian right, has produced its own forms of solidarity, which are designed to diffuse struggles for liberation. The first example is the old divide and conquer method, which is designed to undermine the solidarity on the left. Racism has proven to be particularly useful in dividing and conquering the majority by allowing the dominant powers to bestow privilege on some, but not on others. As one author has observed, for good reason, racism remains the key division within the working class. The history of anti-Black racism in the United States demonstrates how divide and conquer works and can be traced back to the earliest days of the settlement of the American continent in 17th century Virginia. Here, a specific form of US racism was incubated by the white masters with the goal to break up the emerging solidarity of Black and white sharecroppers who worked side by side in the fields. This is not well known, but before actual chattel slavery, there was white and Black sharecroppers, not quite enslaved, who worked side by side in the fields in Virginia, 17th century. If you want to read up on that, check out LaRone Bennett. Beyond the Mayflower, I believe, is the title of the book. Now, the solidarity that emerged between these Black and white sharecroppers is the kind of solidarity that occurs fairly naturally whenever people work side by side. But it's that kind of solidarity that becomes a threat to the masters who are forced to respond. By dividing and conquering the sharecroppers, the masters also accomplish something else. In this case, they managed to use racism to produce a false solidarity between white sharecroppers and white masters, according to which the limited privileges afforded to the white sharecroppers by the white masters would cover up the differences between them. As a result, white sharecroppers now felt more closely related to the white masters than to the Black sharecroppers. None of this means that there is not also a sense in which racism has older roots and runs even deeper, as Sedgwick Robinson and others have argued. But the importance of this specific aspect of racial formation in the context of the United States is important to keep in mind as we search for solutions. Let me talk some more about this aspect of the divide and conquer strategy that is often overlooked. I'm calling it unite and conquer. And I think I made up the term. I'm not sure anybody else has. But this unite and conquer terminology is linked to the false solidarity that white masters in the Southern plantation economy were able to forge with white sharecroppers, a racial solidarity that is not as natural as it might seem at first sight. Unite and conquer later become the foundation for the so-called Southern strategy in the United States that has been powerfully employed in Southern politics since the 1960s, and that President Donald Trump and many others continue to use now with great success. Here, white supremacy and white racism are employed to unite whites of all classes in order to create a majority for the purpose of winning elections. We've seen how it works, right? While the goal of this approach is to conquer, what exactly is conquered here is often overlooked. As would be expected, white supremacy effectively conquers both racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. But, and this is the best kept secret of unite and conquer methods, white supremacy also conquers working and even middle-class white people by fooling them into believing that they have more in common with their white superiors than with fellow Black and brown people. And not coincidentally, unite and conquer controls their theologies by reproducing images of a white God, a white church, and a white religion. Keep in mind, I'm a theologian, so these are questions I'm also investigating here. This identification of white people with the ruling class over against black and brown populations is deep-seated and strong, and it is key to answering the puzzling questions of why so many white people are continuing to vote against their own interests. It's always, why are people voting against their interests? Well, look at this Unite and Conquer. You might find some answers. Note that this is also a problem not only in political elections, but also in economic relations and even in religious communities and the church. As Assad Haider puts it, and I quote, as long as racial solidarity among whites is more powerful than class solidarity across races, both capitalism and whiteness will continue to exist. As I said, the 2024 elections in the United States have shown how this thing works. So we're very much talking about what is also going on at the present. Of course, the specific solidarity of white supremacists unite and conquer does not need to benefit all white people equally. The point is merely to make them believe that it does. As a result, unite and conquer solidarity serves to subdue the majority of white people to the interests of the white elites. Like with divide and conquer, unite and conquer is designed specifically to destroy the solidarity of the working majority, and the results have been telling. Unite and conquer has split not only the working majority, but even churches and religious communities in the United States, whose faiths have been hijacked and hollowed out systematically by big money since it started to push back to the opposition that emerged after the Great Depression and the New Deal in the 1930s. There's a lot of big money that came into US religion at that time, about 100 years ago. And this big money has shaped and continues to shape US religion, which is the interesting thing, the interesting observation here is to say that conservative US religion is actually getting more conservative all the time. This is not, oh, well, we are not progressing or we're somehow stuck in the past, but we're going, I mean, if you want to call it going backwards, that's another question, but it is certainly getting more conservative rather than less over time. And that has to do with certainly these unite and conquer methods and the big money that funds these things. In other words, we can no longer ignore the roots of what are often misunderstood as mere ideological or perhaps theological differences. If you go down in my slide, you'll see me listing nationalism and the heterosexual family here. Just a few comments on this, because these are also examples of unite and conquer. Nationalism is used to diffuse the natural transnational solidarity of working people, and it often goes hand in hand with racism. In Germany, the Nazis were masters at playing these games, and sure, you have studied this history. How nationalism in some ways seemed to be about putting German people in a supreme position, except that my fathers and grandfathers who were Germans didn't really gain much by it, right? That is oftentimes overlooked when nationalism doesn't have a class analysis. The same is true for the heterosexual family, which is also used to defy solidarity among working people, right? You're supposedly have to be faithful to your heterosexual family rather than to other people, which is something that Jesus of Nazareth actually figured out, right? There's this moment in the Gospel of Mark when his mother and his brother and sisters come, and Jesus says, well, who are my mother and my brothers and sisters? Well, heterosexual family solidarity, right? And Jesus says, nah, not that. The one who does the will of God, those are my mothers and brothers and sisters. That's pretty radical. It is also, as I would say here, just as a footnote, a critique of unite and conquer that comes through heterosexual family emphasis. And that's, of course, a huge problem in theology, when in theology they get sucked into family ideology and all of that. Let me say a few words about race and class, because I think this is a topic that needs more reflection. And unfortunately, This is the one that I feel is intentionally underdeveloped. This is again in the Theology and the Capitalocene book, one of the big themes here, how race and class come together. In the words of Berkeley sociologist and law scholar Ian Haney Lopez, racism is a class weapon. This is his sentence. Racism is a class weapon. And Lopez argues, this is a book by the title Merge Left, if you want to check this out. It was written actually before the 2020 election, thinking it would actually change things. And maybe it did in 2020, now in 2024. What Lopez means by talking about racism as a class weapon is that racism harms everyone but the white elites. In other words, racism harms even those white people who are not part of the white elites. Close connection between race and class means, therefore, that racism cannot be defeated without dealing with class, and class conflict cannot be ended without dealing with race. The fundamental problem of race and class is summarized succinctly by African-American historian Barbara Fields, who notes that not all white people have the same, this is a quote from Barbara Fields, quote, not all white people have the same power and not all white people are in the same class position, quote. Along the same lines, African-American studies professor Kianga Yamata-Taylor points out, this is the quote you have on the slide, she points out that, quote, racism in the United States has never been just about abusing Black and brown people just for the sake of doing so. It has always been a means by which the most powerful white men in the country have justified their rule, made their money, and kept the rest of us at bay. Following these trains of thought, a distinction needs to be made between privilege and power, which is instructive for the study of religion and theology as well. On the slide, you have an interventions forum that we did at the Wendland-Cook program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt. And if you Google my name and privilege and power in the Capitalocene, you will see the interventions forum with contributions from a number of colleagues, Charlene Sinclair, a womanist African-American activist, Jin Young Choi, a Muslim lawyer, a woman Bangladeshi from New York City. Chamtoli Haq is the Muslim lawyer, and Jin Young Choi is a Korean New Testament professor. All collaborators here. So the distinction I want to make here is between privilege and power. And it's a distinction I have not really found anywhere in the literature. I mean, I find people talking about the distinction of privilege and power. I'm not the only one making that, but that particular distinction, if you know it from somewhere else, let's talk about it, but I'm just curious. Under the conditions of white supremacist racism, all white people have privilege, whether they realize it or not. I think that's pretty obvious, right? All white people in a racist society, white supremacist society, all white people have privilege. Racial privilege conveys many advantages in the dominant system. It can provide substantial benefits in every area of life that includes politics, culture, religion, family, and the economy. And of course, racial privilege is always systemic, which means that one can be privileged without feeling privileged. So as I make this distinction, I want to make it very clear that privilege is real. This is not to downplay the importance of privilege or the reality of it. However, what I'm arguing is that the systemic privilege does not immediately translate into power, which is also systemic. While all white people benefit in some ways from white racial privilege, they do not all have the same power. Although, of course, we know that some power goes along with privilege. Power, according to sociologist Max Weber, is the ability of one person to exercise influence on another person against their interest. So the ability to influence another person against their interest is power. It's just a rule of thumb definition here. Extending that definition to social systems, the question is where the ability to influence others against their interests is located. labor relations exemplify what's at stake. And this goes for the US, I think, as well as for Europe and elsewhere. White warehouse workers enjoy white privilege compared to black and brown, but they do not have the same power as white warehouse managers or white warehouse owners, let alone the billionaire heirs of Sam Walton who control Walmart. This insight tends to come as a rude awakening to many white working people, because they're led to believe that, well, your whiteness is what connects you to the white managers and the white Waltons. Comes as a rude awakening, but it's even more unsettling for white professionals, white academics, and white religious leaders who enjoy a great deal of white privilege and even some power, but whose power to truly impact the system is embarrassingly small. Now I'm talking about ourselves. Talking about, say, my own privilege as a privileged professor at a privileged elite university in the United States. Now we're under fire these days, but we're doing still fairly well. And we have all this wonderful privilege at the top of the academic system, yet surprisingly little power. This insight, of course, also comes as a surprise to many non-white people because they fail to distinguish between privilege and power, often overestimate the power of white people. The result is disappointment and frustration all around. As a rule of thumb, it seems that too much focus on privilege covers up the question of power and the related topic of class. So it's not an innocent mistake to emphasize privilege too much. It's a cover-up. The confusion of privilege and power, therefore, benefits the dominant system as it hides the location of dominant power behind the notion of privilege, and it allows for assigning blame to those with some privilege but less power. In many cases, well-meaning people of faith who realize their privilege accept the blame, as well as the related charge to make a difference. Neglecting the difference of privilege and power, members of the white middle class conclude that they can change the world, at least regarding racism and sexism, and perhaps even regarding some ecological destruction. Let's do it, right? We can do it. Activism is really here also. Unfortunately, there's not that much power here. And so members of the middle class who are led to think that they can change the world because of their cumulative racial, gender, and sexual privilege still rarely pose much of a threat to systemic forms of domination and oppression, let alone the system of neoliberal global capitalism. Confusing privilege of which they may have a considerable amount and power of which they have much less, they're oblivious to the need for broad-based solidarity of those who are not running the system. There's a current book by a journalist, Tim Bevins. If We Burn is the title. And the book is important because he describes the history of the global protest movement between 2010 and 2020, saying that we've seen more global protests than ever in the history of humanity, which have made less difference than ever in the history of humanity. And this is not an accusation, but simply an analysis of perhaps a similar thing that I'm talking about, the distinction of privilege and power, and the assumption that privilege immediately translates into power. Because what prevents you then is thinking about how you actually build power. So this is now the question, what do we do? How can the kind of solidarity be formed that has the power to defeat exploitation and oppression along the lines of race and class and alongside gender? Here, I want to quote Keeanga-Yamahtta-Taylor again, who explores the power lodged in relations of labor and class when she talks a potential for solidarity that has to do with the fact that when one group of workers suffer oppression, it negatively affects all workers. You have the quotes here on the slide from her book, from hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. When one group of workers suffer oppression, it negatively affects all workers. There is, according to Taylor, a material foundation for solidarity and unity within the working class. In other words, Solidarity emerges in relation to the common pressures experienced by the working majority. That was, of course, the case with the white and black sharecroppers in 17th century Virginia, of whom we talked just a little earlier. Without this material foundation, solidarity may not be an option. This is something I have emphasized in my recent book, Theology in the Capitalocene, as well. Coining the notion of deep solidarity over a dozen years ago. That's a notion actually that came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, which was a moment when a rudimentary understanding of class emerged again in the United States after a period of long silence. That their material foundations for solidarity means that it is not primarily an illusion, as it often is for conservatives who promote a sense of false solidarity via racism, sexism, nationalism, and so on. But neither, and this is important, neither is solidarity merely a moral imperative for privileged people, as it is often the case with the liberals and some on the left. The true potential for solidarity that I'm talking about here, picking up Taylor, is rooted in realities of exploitation and oppression that affect the many, not just a few. This was one of the lasting insights of the Occupy Wall Street movement's recognition of the difference between the 99% who have to work for a living and the 1% minority. Keep in mind, of course, that working people, wherever you go, even in the United States, are always in the majority. Of course, working people in this case are the most diverse group that the world has ever seen. This is not about white men in hard hats or factory workers. This is really about the most diverse conglomerate of people that you could ever imagine. So something is happening here. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor helpfully pushes the boundaries of progressive politics here when she notes that the popular idea of white people becoming allies to Black people, she says, quoting from her, doesn't quite capture the degree to which Black and white workers are inextricably linked. So allyship here is perhaps a bit of dead. In order to understand what is going on and to do something about it, I would now argue that this kind of solidarity has to be explored, and in order to explore it, a basic awareness of class is required. Since I'm a theologian, let me add a couple of theological images and ideas that are intended to show that these are old dynamics. This is not just something that Rieger invented in the year, whatever it was, 2011, after Occupy Wall Street, but these things go back. Some theologians might find such a down-to-earth understanding of solidarity. This, talking about my colleagues here, some of my colleagues may, hopefully, Matthew, you're with me still. They might find this to be a little too ordinary and mundane, perhaps even too self-absorbed, focusing basically on self-interest here, common pressures that we experience. This self-interest does not have to be confused with selfishness. Even Jesus' commandments to love one's neighbor as oneself concedes self-interest. And self-interest becomes more interesting when it is understood that the interest of the neighbor and the interest of the self are linked. This goes back to Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas's interpretations of this commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, which they argue in their own ways is to say that the neighbor is always part of the self. So it's not a moral commandment, but just a recognition that your neighbor is already always part of yourself. Two Jewish philosophers here pointing the way, I think, is a good move. It also clarifies that the foundations and relationships here are not necessarily grounded in some ethical or metaphysical realm, but in actual relations of power. Coming back to the question of power. Solidarity, therefore, is a fact of life that needs to be deepened and developed, not merely an idea or a task. I'm even saying that the Apostle Paul, who's not necessarily understood as a progressive, figured some of this out in his own way when he noted about the body of Christ that if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. This is not you should suffer, but this is what happens, right? If an injury to one is an injury to all, this is how the unions in the United States put it. So keeping in mind the often overlooked lack of power, we can now take another look at privilege. There's a well-founded concern that solidarity talk can lead to erasing the differentials between Black and brown and white people, therefore to letting white people off the hook. Worse yet, certain ways to talk about solidarity might neglect profound Christian processes of confession of sin and repentance for white, racial, and gendered privilege, which are both crucial to theology and to the practice of faith. To state it clearly, erasing the differences between Black and brown and white people and letting white people off the hook is not how racism is defeated and solidarity builds. This is why deep solidarity is not about promoting uniformity, but about actively embracing difference as a constructive element in the formation of solidarity, with special attention to the role that Black and brown people and women are already playing and how it can be expanded without imposing additional burdens on them. The role of white people in all of this, that is the role of those who enjoy white privilege, needs special scrutiny, which once again requires the distinction of privilege and power. The mistaken assumption that privilege equals power creates several problems for solidarity and for dealing with privilege. It raises expectations on all sides for what white people can do to fix the problems of white privilege and white supremacy. As a result, privileged white people typically overestimate what limited power they have, and non-white people hope for outcomes that cannot be achieved if privilege does not equal power. Not surprisingly, frustration and failed efforts of transformation are common, augmented by a misdirection but ever-deepening sense of sin and guilt. It is therefore not uncommon for well-meaning white people, especially in the middle class, to blame themselves for either not being able to change things or for being the prime cause of all exploitation and oppression in the world. We've had a little bit of that in Germany, certainly when I grew up. Don't know how much of that is still around. Likewise, it is not uncommon for Black and brown people to assume that they're all on their own, except perhaps for a few white allies who seek to divest themselves from power they do not have and fail to develop whatever limited power they do have. As a result, the agency of such allies is quite small and doomed to failure. Not surprising that Bevins then finds that a lot of these social movements did not really do what they tried to accomplish. In response to these problems, the development of deep solidarity can help address this by distinguishing privilege and power with a clearer sense of how the differentials of privilege can be addressed more constructively in order to develop communal power. In the process, more appropriate understanding of sin, guilt, and repentance can help. If privilege and power are distinct, confession and repentance for unchecked privilege can translate into embracing alternative forms of power. Armed with a distinction of privilege and power, confession and repentance for sin can be practiced, for instance, where the white 99% breaks the bonds of white privilege and white supremacy by siding with their Black and brown siblings against the dominant power represented by the executive power. In the process, privilege can be addressed and the power of solidarity is set free. The reversal that is characteristic of repentance is also reflected in the Jesus movement. Let me come back to Jesus one more time without being offensive to anyone. Because what's interesting here is that these dynamics come out of a liberation struggle that in some ways is still seen in some of the ancient documents. Goes back to what I was saying earlier about Jesus' critique of the heterosexual family, and also by understanding that there's a false peace that is not helpful. There are some passages that some of you may remember about Jesus bringing a sword rather than peace. That's always confusing to progressive people, but it is addressing the false peace it seems to me, of right-wing solidarity in order to establish a different kind of solidarity that's based not on sameness, but related to difference. All right, let me summarize a few things and move on here quickly. Deep solidarity here then is not about letting privilege off the hook. Neither is it about claiming sameness or becoming colorblind. Solidarity is built not on sameness or identity, but on an understanding of the fact that the few are benefiting at the expense of the many, which is how the neoliberal capitalist system maintains itself. As a result, this situation can only be changed by the many, not the few, which requires solidarity and not merely allyship. In this context, the distinction of privilege and power does two things for the formation of solidarity. One, it enables the acknowledgement of white privilege. And two, it allows for the subversion of dominant power. On this basis, the limited power white privilege bestows on our white people can be put to use in challenging the dominant power to which unchecked white privilege contributes. And ultimately, this is how then white privilege, by using it, brushing it against the grain, can be deconstructed. Directing our attention to class in this context does not mean ignoring racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual differences, just the opposite. There's a common misunderstanding of which Barbara Fields reminds us. Here's a quote, one more quote from Barbara Fields. Quote, when someone in the press says working class or working class voters, they invariably mean white people. They forget that Afro-Americans in this country are working people. Most Latinx people, however you define that ambiguous term, are working people. Southeast Asian migrants, most of them are working people. And indeed, the same is true for a good many East Asian migrants, end of quote. In other words, the working majority is more diverse than any other social formation the world has ever seen. It's proportionally Black, brown, and female, and this is fundamental to the work of solidarity. In sum, deep solidarity accomplishes two unexpected things. One, not only is it built on a challenge of privilege, but it also manages, and this is true, to employ differences for the common good and the power of resistance. So this is not merely acknowledge different, but actually make use of them for the common good and the power of resistance. These differences can be multiple, tied simultaneously to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, nationality, and even religion. So even religious difference makes this solidarity stronger rather than weaker. Deep solidarity, therefore, amounts to a reversal of the solidarity on the right, which is grounded in sameness and privileged racial and religious identities. By contrast, the solidarity on the left is guided by experiences of economic exploitation that affect the working majority all the way to the 99%, which is always compounded by race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or nationality. Significant guidance comes therefore from those who experience these compounded forms of exploitation, domination, and oppression in their own bodies, because they are more existentially affected by the system than anyone else. Deep solidarity needs to start from below, which does not mean that the burden of the work should be on the shoulders of the proverbial least of these, but vision and leadership have roots where the pressures are greatest. Theology is not an afterthought of solidarity, but strikes as its roots. The solidarity of the right offers a theological justification of the status quo, building on the perennial religion of empire that equates the divine with the dominant powers. This is why its solidarity on the right implies that everybody looking alike, talking alike, thinking alike, and so on comes together. This is often misinterpreted by theologians as orthodoxy, along with nationalist, white, racial, and heterosexual gender identity. The solidarity on the other side, by contrast, finds the divine elsewhere. And this is what excites me in my own work, finding the divine elsewhere, informed by the incarnation of Christ in solidarity with the multitude of common people everywhere rather than the elites. This is Christianity. But you find this insight in other religious traditions as well. If you simply take the three Abrahamic traditions, that is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, you can go back to the Exodus traditions, which you have in all three, which are ultimately solidarity traditions of a slave population. The Hebrew prophets, which you find all three, Jesus, which you find in at least two of the three, and Mary, who in some ways models herself on Hannah, the mother of Samuel, and of which the Quran talks a lot more than the Bible. Very interesting too. All examples of how solidarity is built not dominantly from the top down, but from the bottom up. So in this context, you can even do some theological work that puts things together differently and that contributes to the kind of theology that I'm talking about. This last slide is about a project that we're currently engaging in the Wendland-Cook program in religion and justice at Vanderbilt. We're calling it Solidarity Circles. And tongue-in-cheek, we're talking about a great awakening in the United States. The great awakenings, of course, are these big moments of religious revival that oftentimes have social components that are overlooked. They're not just, religious things, but they're moments of revolution. They're moments of actual challenge to the dominant status quo. So when we're talking about solidarity here, we're not merely philosophizing about it, but experimenting with it. But let me summarize this with a couple of more remarks and then open it up to questions. As deep solidarity then aims at the transformation of privilege and power, it also provides the tools for it. The transformation of privileged straight white men may serve as an example, and of course you could say, this is my own example. If they reappropriate the limited power their heterosexual white European American privilege affords them to help build the power of the working multitude, various things change for good. Probably one's alignment with the dominant powers and rejecting unite and conquer strategies, including false orthodoxies, will have consequences. Those who go down that route long enough will be marked as traitors who eventually cannot go home anymore. So it took 33 years for me to come back to Bonn. That's perhaps only slightly kidding. But engaging the dominant powers and using your privilege differently will not go unnoticed and unpunished. Conversion and repentance, theological terms, religious terms, are built into this model as the transformation of white heterosexual privilege is inevitable when deep solidarity is embraced and developed. So even if you're white heterosexual male, like myself, there is some conversion at work here that you may not notice initially, but that will catch up with you. In Christianity, some of the holiness traditions were aware of this and embodied it at their best. A young colleague of mine at Vanderbilt has described this as theological queerness. Again, holiness traditions, queer traditions, that's certainly an interesting conversation that we can also talk about. Note that there is a class base from which deep solidarity can emerge. As the 99% who do not belong to the executive class are beginning to understand that they share some things in common despite their differences, starting with their exploitation. Exploited are workers of all races and genders on whose backs the neoliberal capitalist economy is built, but also the members of the middle class of all races and genders who may find it hard to admit that their jobs are increasingly precarious and who have to come to terms with the fact that their children can no longer count on moving up the social ladder. The good news is that we might find not only challenges here, but also inspirations in these conflict-laden positions. Thank you.